mean, I absolutely think global imbalance are once again a primary concern. I think the French presidency of the G7 has chosen to highlight imbalances as an issue, and I think it's a wise decision. Why? Well, largely because there's been an increase in the imbalance in the past few years, and almost as important, that imbalance is now incredibly concentrated in China. That's clear if you look at the goods trade data, where China's surplus has just soared. It's up $900 billion compared to where it was before the pandemic. Net exports are contributing quite significantly to China's growth. And if you go back and look at export volumes and compared to import volumes, China's export volumes are up about 40% compared to where they were before the pandemic. And import volumes are basically flat. They're up 1%. This has translated into a world where other exporting powers, like Europe traditionally, are seeing their growth impeded. European exports actually shrank the last few years, while Chinese exports overperform global trade. So we're clearly seeing both a rise in imbalances. We're seeing those imbalances have an impact on the performance of other economies. And we're increasingly, I think, understanding that an unbalanced pattern of trade will almost inevitably give rise to supply chain vulnerabilities that raise additional concerns about strategic vulnerabilities. So I 100% believe that imbalances are a concern. So I think one of the ironies of the second Trump administration is they've kind of let drop the ball when it comes to thinking about imbalances in the global economy. The Trump administration, more or less, at least in their first incarnation, thought tariffs would solve every problem. They would solve America's problems with trade. They would be a source of leverage. They would help President Donald J. Trump win multiple Nobel Peace Prizes. They could replace sanctions because you could do secondary tariffs rather than secondary sanctions. Moreover, in addition to kind of overusing tariffs and thinking tariffs solved the problem, the Trump administration in its second term has focused a lot of its tariffs on countries that actually aren't a problem when it comes to the broader question of trade imbalances. Brazil simply is not a problem on a global scale when it comes to trade imbalances. Small surplus, but nothing to speak of. The U.S. runs a bilateral surplus with Brazil, yet the Brazil got hit by a higher tariff than China for reasons that are tied to politics, not tied to any strategy around imbalances. Canada runs balanced trade globally, yet Canada has been singled out by this administration. The U.S. runs a manufacturing surplus with Canada, yet we're constantly criticizing Canadian trade policy. Conversely, this administration simply hasn't, by at least what's available in the press, made China's currency an issue, hasn't made Japan's very weak yen an issue, didn't negotiate with the Koreans over a weak won, even though I think there's an incredible argument that the National Pension Service, Korea's sovereign wealth fund, and its outflows have contributed to the weakness of the won. I simply don't think this administration has put forward a serious effort to address imbalances. The US and the EU are increasingly in the same boat. The US has, although the Trump administration maybe has put less emphasis on it than it did in the first Trump administration, the US has long been concerned about trade imbalances, trade deficits, persistent trade deficits, and long expressed concern about China's trade surplus in particular. Over the past few years, the U.S. deficit has gotten bigger and China's surplus has gotten way bigger. And as China's surplus has gotten bigger, if you just look at goods trade, and there's a separate set of changes happening on the investment income balance that are tied to higher U.S. interest rates. But it's important, I think, to just look at old-fashioned goods trade. You look at old-fashioned goods trade, Europe's surplus is actually shrinking. And if you take out Ireland, which actually, the European EU-wide surplus is now down to somewhere between 50 and $100 billion. It is actually quite small. European trade volumes, export volumes, have been shrinking the past 2 years. So there's a harmony and this deep sense of interest. There's an understanding that Asia's rising surplus and China's rising surplus and undervalued Asian currencies are having an impact on both the US and the European economy. And I think there's also an understanding now that concerns about economic security and supply chain dependence don't just affect the United States. They're clearly spilling over and affecting Europe. So there should be the basis for cooperation. That said, the Trump administration, by deciding to put tariffs on Europe, has made it very difficult for Europe to cooperatively work with the US and develop a joint strategy towards those countries in Asia that are really adding significantly to many of the world's imbalances. The Trump administration, in its first incarnation, famously told President Macron that the U.S. didn't want Europe to be involved in the negotiations with China that led to the Phase 1 deal, because then the U.S. would have to share some of the benefits with Europe. There's been an attitude on the part of the U.S. side that has pushed back recently against cooperation, even as I think the Europeans are increasingly seeing the potential for gaining leverage through a joint approach. So on one hand, I think there absolutely should be scope for cooperation. On the other hand, it will take some rather fundamental shifts in the US for that to happen.